In the damp spring of 1891, a small ledger arrived at the county clerk's office in Cotton Hollow, Arkansas. Stitched in canvas, handwritten in fading brown ink, and bearing the seal of St. Augustine's Charity for the Feeble and Forgotten. The cover bore no name of an institution, just a single phrase, "For the salvation of the small." Inside, 33 names were recorded, each one under the age of 10. Most entries had only first names: Caleb, Ruth, Elijah, Clara, while others were marked with identifiers like "found near tracks" or "donated by uncle." All were logged under the custody of a new rural facility erected quietly beyond the tree line at the end of Black Hollow Road. It was not on any public registry, no formal announcement had been made, but the town whispered of it, a place for the defective, a place where noise was punished and silence was called grace. It had once been a tobacco barn, converted with grants from a religious medical trust out of Little Rock. Locals called it a mercy. They said it would lessen the burden on families, a kindness in the name of progress. The outer walls were painted a gentle white. The front lawn was kept unnaturally still, as if trimmed by someone who never blinked. The woman who oversaw it was Sister Therese. She wore pale gloves year-round and walked with her arms always folded, pressing her knuckles gently against her ribs like she was holding something still inside her. She told visiting clergy that her mission was to remove chaos from the young mind. She claimed her charges were being shaped toward sainthood through order. The few who visited were shown tidy rooms, perfectly made beds, shelves labeled with small names written in Latin. What they did not see, what no visitor ever saw, were the ones already taken to the basement level, where silence was not only expected but demanded. Within the first 3 months of operation, 12 children were registered in the ledger. By autumn, that number had risen to 33. No one had ever seen them in town. No teachers recalled their presence at nearby schools. When winter fell, the townspeople simply assumed they had all been relocated, perhaps adopted, perhaps moved to larger hospitals in the north. Sister Therese rarely spoke in town, but when she did, she would mention new placements and healing journeys. She spoke of quiet progress, of little ones being transformed. But behind the wrought iron gate, the screams had long since stopped, not because suffering had ended, but because throats had been trained not to cry. There were no funerals, no coffins, no obituaries. But one by one, the names began to fade from local memory, until only the ledger held proof that these children had existed at all. Their birthdays were replaced with dates of intake. Their surnames, when present, were struck through and replaced with numbers. Their illnesses, real or imagined, were all written in the same hand, in the same script, with the same diagnosis: vocality syndrome. No physicians had ever published such a term, no textbook held its definition. But to Sister Therese it meant one thing: the child made noise when they shouldn't have, laughed too loud, cried too much, sang to themselves in church pews, and for this they were taken to Black Hollow. By the start of 1892, snow had melted down the sides of the building, soaking the dirt yard into a thick clay-colored sludge. But inside, the walls were clean, the air faintly sharp with vinegar and dried rosewater. A new intake arrived that March, a boy named Josiah, age 5, sent from a parish 3 counties away. The priest who delivered him noted that Josiah had a habit of whispering to invisible friends, and once screamed for 8 hours straight after a thunderclap. The priest wrote, "Unfit for parish rearing, requires deep correction." His name was added to the ledger in the same brown ink, under the same heading, with the same silent fate awaiting him in the cold rooms below. Over the next decade, the building would undergo 2 renovations, both funded by anonymous donors under the guise of spiritual medicine. The surrounding woods thickened, the road to the asylum grew harder to travel, and the name Black Hollow fell out of maps. But the ledger remained. 33 entries, 33 children. And long after the asylum was sealed, only 2 would ever walk out again. One with a jaw that never healed, the other with no memory of her own name. The rest were never declared dead, never mourned, only registered, only documented, only erased in silence. Next came the nun whose hands never trembled. She did not arrive with ceremony, no procession, no papers of ordainment, just a trunk, a cross that never left her throat, and hands that never shook. They called her Sister Therese, though no one in Cotton Hollow could say where she came from before the asylum. Some whispered France, others said Mississippi or somewhere colder, somewhere where ice stayed on window panes till May. But what was known, what could not be denied, was how still her presence was. Even in the wind, her veil barely moved. Even among chaos, she never raised her voice. People trusted that kind of quiet. In a world of crying children and failing crops, she brought something more rare than hope. She brought control. She spoke in parables, not biblical ones, not exactly. When asked about the children, she'd smile gently and say, "A pot that boils must be cooled, not broken." When a mother wept at the gate, begging to see her son just once more, Sister Therese laid a gloved hand on the woman's shoulder and said, "Your grief is noise, and we are here to remove it from him." The woman never came back. No parent did, not twice. Yet somehow that absence wasn't seen as cruelty. It was painted as mercy. Therese convinced them that their children were not being lost, but reformed. Silenced not in violence, but in salvation. She used words like sanctification, discipline of sound, rebirth through hush. And they believed her. Because she never flinched. Because her gloves were always clean. She wore those gloves at all hours. Cotton in the summer, lambskin in the cold. No one ever saw her bare fingers. She said it was to protect the children, to preserve the purity of touch. But behind locked doors, some of the older children whispered of what the gloves were hiding. They said she dipped them in vinegar and pressed them against mouths, that she left no bruises, only a burning that made them obedient. They spoke of something worse, something no one wanted to believe, that she had no fingernails at all, only skin stretched too tightly, stitched with thread so pale it vanished under light. These were just rumors, of course, but in a place where no one returned, every rumor sounded like truth. She kept a small room behind the chapel. Not quite an office, not quite a cell. Inside, the walls were lined with sketches, diagrams of mouths open and closed, drawings of tongues with red X's across them, postures annotated with phrases like optimal for repentance and eliminates self-expression. She believed noise was a disease, one that infected the soul and spread from child to child like mold. Her sermons to the staff were brief but absolute. To stop the child is to save the adult. Words are weapons from the mouth of Lucifer. She told them the tongue was the root of rebellion, that to cure a child, one must first make them still, then make them silent, then make them pure. She installed no clocks in the halls, no mirrors, no windows above waist height. She said children were too easily corrupted by reflection and time. Each hallway echoed with the sound of dripping water, though no one ever found the source. The floors were hand-scrubbed with salt and boiled milk. Visitors commented on the strange smell, a mixture of sweetness and something burnt. She called it cleansing aroma. The children called it warning. Therese was not a doctor. She had no nursing certificate, no degree, no parish records of baptism or profession. But she carried herself like a surgeon and spoke like scripture. And in that time, in that place, that was enough. Authorities didn't question her methods because they didn't ask to see them. She provided reports, always handwritten, always signed with her looping initials and always ending with the same phrase. Progress ongoing. Noise reduced. No inspectors ever visited twice. No one asked why there were no adoption records. No one wondered why there were no photographs. She called her methods harmonic recalibration. She claimed the soul had a sound, and when a child's noise clashed with it, they suffered. Her treatments were designed to tune the soul to silence. She believed true peace could be achieved only through the complete erasure of emotional outburst. Joy was permitted only in prayer. Sorrow was not. Laughter was labeled indulgence. Screaming was a sin, and crying was punished with isolation and mouth fasting, a practice that involved the child's lips being bound with linen soaked in anise and clove oil until their throat forgot the urge. Over time, her reputation spread, not with scandal but with admiration. Other towns sent her their broken children. Her name was spoken with reverence by priests and county judges. She was invited to speak at a child-rearing seminar in Little Rock, but declined. She said her place was where sound is buried. No one argued. No one interfered. No one thought to ask why no child had ever been seen walking out from behind her gate. But one girl did survive, long enough to hear the singing in the basement. Eliza May arrived in early June when the fields smelled of rot and honeysuckle. She had come from a parish in Missouri, young and plain and eager to serve. Her letters of reference said she was obedient, soft-spoken, good with children. The kind of woman who never questioned why certain doors stayed locked. But Eliza kept a diary, small, leather-bound, with a broken clasp and fading initials from her father's saddlebag. And in that diary, between pages pressed with dried clover, she wrote what she saw in the room no one mentioned. The room without beds. It was located in the west wing through a door disguised as a pantry wall. No sign marked it, no key was needed, only permission. Sister Therese opened it for Eliza during her second week, placing one gloved hand on the girl's shoulder and saying, "You are ready to witness stillness." Inside, the room smelled like old sweat and something metallic. The walls were smooth and painted the same dull cream as the rest of the asylum. No windows, no lamps. Just a row of oil sconces burning faint and low along the top seam, casting the room in amber shadow. 32 wooden frames stood in perfect rows, bolted to the floor, each one built like a vertical cradle, narrow and upright, with leather harnesses that buckled across chest, waist, knees, and brow. They looked like something made for carrying mannequins through war. Each child stood inside one, strapped upright, eyes open. Some stared straight ahead. Others closed their eyes as if in prayer or escape. One girl drooled steadily onto her collarbone, her chin unable to rise under the pressure of the brow strap. Eliza saw bruises blooming along rib cages where the chest bindings pressed too tight. A boy's feet dangled 2 inches above the footrest, his toes twitching with every heartbeat. Sister Therese whispered, "This is the first phase of cleansing. Movement leads to noise. Noise leads to self." Then she turned away, satisfied. The term was stillness therapy. Eliza wrote it down with shaking hands that night, then underlined it twice. Sister Therese claimed it reset the nervous system, that by removing the child's ability to twist, fidget, or react, the body would slowly forget the impulse to cry or scream. Children remained in the harnesses for up to 18 hours per day. They were fed through thin straws threaded past the cheek strap and relieved themselves into slotted pails they were trained not to speak of. If one fainted, they were splashed with rose water and returned to upright position. If one cried, the room was sealed for the night and no one came until morning. Eliza once asked where they slept. Therese smiled and said, "They are being shaped. Beds are for finished children." The next day, a boy named Levi was found with ligature burns so deep around his shoulders that his skin had cracked open. He did not weep. He simply stared at the ceiling, mouthing something no one could hear. Eliza leaned in and thought she caught the word home, but the lips moved too slow, too dry to know for sure. Levi was gone the next morning. His frame stood empty. The straps had been freshly oiled. There were no lullabies, no bedtime stories. Only a metronome that clicked from behind a hidden panel, its tick-tick-tick like a mocking imitation of a heartbeat. Sister Therese said it was there to help them synchronize with the divine rhythm. Some children began to sway in time, only to be beaten gently on the knees with wooden rods until they remembered that stillness meant salvation. Motion was rebellion. Crying was proof of possession. Sleep, when it came, was a thin, delirious spell, broken by dreams they dared not speak aloud. Eliza wrote less after her 4th week. Her entries became shorter, fewer dates, more ink smudges where tears had dried. But on July 17th, she wrote one full sentence. "There are no blankets in hell, only straps." That night, she stood outside the room without beds and listened. Nothing, not even breathing. The stillness was complete, and far more terrifying than any scream. Next came the marbles pressed between their teeth. At Black Hollow, silence was not the absence of sound. It was a posture, a discipline, a proof of obedience. Sister Therese called it sacred hush, and it was drilled into the children like arithmetic. Crying was not discouraged, it was corrected. Screaming wasn't punished, it was exorcised. From the moment a child entered the building, their vocal cords were treated like infected organs in need of restraint. But restraint alone wasn't enough. What Therese devised was not merely silencing, it was instructional inhibition. Her methods were not loud, they were precise, ritualistic, designed not only to suppress noise but to convert the act of silence into spiritual submission. She began with wax, small handmade marbles molded in her quarters late at night, scented faintly with lavender oil and marked with faint indentations where her gloved fingers had pressed them into shape. Each morning, during what she called quieting hour, children were lined up in pairs. They were given one wax marble to place gently between their back molars. Not chewed, not swallowed, held. The goal was endurance. A child who could keep the wax intact for the full hour earned a single raisin at supper. A child who cracked it faced escalation. Sister Therese claimed that stillness began in the jaw, that motion in the mouth was the root of disobedience, and so the mouth must be retrained, gently at first, cruelly if needed. Eliza witnessed the transition from wax to stone in her 5th week. A boy named Ansel bit through his wax marble during a coughing fit and immediately began to cry. The marble had split and a shard lodged in his gum, drawing blood. He tried to explain, voice shaking, but Therese simply turned to Eliza and said, "He has not yet chosen peace." Ansel was taken to a separate room, one Eliza had never been allowed to enter, and returned 3 hours later with a single rounded stone lodged between his molars, wired into place with copper thread. His lips were pale, and his eyes didn't blink as often as they should. That night, Eliza saw him spit blood into the straw of his supper bowl. Within days, the others understood. If you cracked the wax, you received the stone. If you cracked the stone, you were sent below. No one explained what below meant. But every child who returned from there had lips that trembled without sound and a look that didn't belong to anyone still waiting to be saved. Sister Therese praised them as corrected. She said their spirits had been boiled clean. She said their silence was now sacred. Internal bleeding became common. Several children developed ulcers along the tongue or cheek lining. One girl, Miriam, began swallowing blood in her sleep, not out of fear, but out of habit. Eliza found a page torn from her prayer book tucked into Miriam's pillow, stained at the corners. In it, the girl had written only 4 words, over and over again: "I'm being emptied out." But the most haunting lesson came from Thomas, the smallest in the ward. He was no more than 4, with sunken eyes and thin lashes that stuck together when he blinked. He had never spoken since arrival. Therese believed he had been born in rebellion, mute not from trauma but from refusal to obey noise itself. One morning he began to cough violently during morning recitation. Eliza rushed to him thinking he was choking. What came from his mouth was not bile or blood, but a small, crude crucifix, carved from stale bread, blackened with blood, and bitten down into a shape unmistakable. It had been hidden in his cheek for days. Therese said nothing. She took it in her gloved hand and burned it in the stove. She told the children, "Symbols do not save the disobedient, only silence does." From that day forward, no bread was served whole. All crusts were inspected. Children were made to chew facing forward, hands flat against their knees. Even the smallest cough was met with inspection, and every new child was introduced not to a meal but to a marble warm from Therese's pocket. The next horror came with eyes sewn shut, not to blind but to silence the gaze. Eliza had not meant to find him. It was raining, one of those long Arkansas rains that poured in slow, thick sheets like syrup down the windows, and Sister Therese had sent her to fetch vinegar from the cellar, the kind used to rinse cloth and cleanse skin. The key she was given was brass, smooth from years of being turned. The cellar door groaned open like a secret. The air beneath was heavy and sour. Stone walls damp with seepage. The ceiling so low she had to stoop. There were shelves of bottled tinctures and rows of folded linens wrapped in oilskin. But what caught her breath was the sound. Not a moan, not quite, not words, just a slow, rhythmless hum, like the memory of a lullaby trapped inside a throat too long punished. She followed it, her candle flickering against the dark. Behind a partition of hanging sheets and wooden crates was a small alcove with a rusted cot. The boy was there, knees drawn to chest, fingers clasped tight against his sternum like he was holding something in. He didn't startle when she stepped close, didn't speak. But when the candlelight passed over his face, Eliza saw what had been done. His eyelids were sewn shut, not haphazardly, not with the clumsy stitches of violence, but with a surgeon's precision. Fine thread, even spacing. Each lid pulled closed so gently it almost looked peaceful. Almost. He was not blind. The whites of his eyes showed through small gaps where the thread didn't meet perfectly. The lids twitched as she approached, like someone dreaming beneath them. His body bore no bruises, no bindings. But he was thin, and his skin had the pallor of someone who hadn't seen daylight in years. When she whispered, "Can you hear me?" he didn't nod. He only hummed louder. Eliza returned upstairs in a daze, the vinegar forgotten. She found Sister Therese in the chapel, polishing the brass rail with slow, deliberate circles. When Eliza spoke of the boy, of what she'd seen, Therese didn't flinch. She set down the cloth and folded her gloved hands. "That is Elias. He is in stage 3, she said softly. He saw too much light. It blinded his sense of order. She offered no further explanation. Eliza, still trembling, asked how long he had been kept below. Therese answered without hesitation. 3 years. Then she added almost tenderly, "He used to cry at the sun." Later that night, Eliza wrote those words into her diary. Over and over, "He cried at the sun." And she began to wonder what else had been punished here under the name of salvation. She had heard of children forbidden to laugh. She had seen lips stitched shut, though never admitted aloud. But this was something deeper. This was a kind of blindness meant not to harm, but to contain. Not to destroy the eyes, but to silence what they reached for. In the days that followed, Eliza found ways to return to the cellar, always under pretense, always in brief stolen moments. Each time, Elias sat in the same position, each time humming. She brought him water once. He didn't drink it, but he held the cup in both hands like it was something holy. Another time she read him a psalm aloud. He made no sound, but one tear slipped beneath the seam of his right eyelid and rolled down his cheek like oil. The others never spoke of him. When she mentioned his name to the children during supper, none responded, not even a glance. She began to wonder if they were told he was dead, or worse, if they'd been told he was transformed. Sister Therese had a term she used in passing, visual disobedience. She claimed some children look too often toward movement and chase the bright when they ought to follow the hush. Perhaps Elias had watched birds through the window. Perhaps he smiled too long at the sun. Perhaps he wept at the sight of the world he once knew. Whatever it was, Therese had deemed his gaze dangerous enough to seal it. Eliza never saw him stand, never heard his voice. But once, just once, she caught him tapping gently on the cot frame with one finger. It was faint, arrhythmic, until she noticed the pattern. It wasn't random. It repeated. 3 taps, pause, 1 tap, 2, 3. She realized days later it was the beginning of a hymn. One the children used to sing before Therese outlawed melody altogether. Elias wasn't gone. He was buried alive inside his own face. Soon Eliza would discover the room where they were forced to hum, wearing stained glass over their mouths. There was a corridor beneath Black Hollow that no staff ever admitted to using. No signs, no air, no light except what flickered from above through slats too thin to count as windows. Eliza only found it because the key Sister Therese gave her one morning fit more locks than she'd been told. She wasn't meant to turn it, but she did. The hallway descended at a slant, like the building itself had grown downward instead of up. Cold swept the walls. The stone here was older, rough, cracked, untouched by lime wash. And at the end there was a door that opened without creak, without resistance, as though it had been waiting to swing open for years. Inside was not darkness, but color. It was the quiet that hit her first. Not silence, quiet. The kind that breathes, the kind that listens. 30 or so children stood in rows, perfectly spaced, not moving, not bound. And each one wore a mask of stained glass molded to the shape of a face. The colors weren't bright. They were bruised, purples, murky greens, dull reds, and shades that didn't belong in church windows. The masks were held in place by fine wire, twisted around the back of each child's head with no visible straps, no padding. Just glass against skin. Their eyes were closed beneath the fragments. Their mouths hummed. Above them, dozens of delicate chimes hung from the ceiling. Slivers of crystal, some no larger than a fingernail, others long enough to brush against a shoulder if the child dared to lift their head. Each was tuned differently, and each vibrated slightly as the humming below guided them. The room had no natural light. The colors that danced across the walls came only from a lantern behind a rotating filter, casting reds, then blues, then yellows in slow turns, like the shifting of stained sunlight through broken sanctuary windows. It was not beautiful. It was ritual. Sister Therese entered behind Eliza, her footsteps silent even on stone. She whispered, "This is the choir of hush. They are learning to harmonize with purity." Eliza tried to speak, but Therese raised a gloved finger and said, "No, listen." The humming rose, flat, soft, trembling, and the crystals answered. Some sang back with pure tone, others shattered quietly to the floor. When a child's voice did not match the assigned frequency, the glass above them fractured. Therese did not flinch. "When the spirit misaligns," she murmured, "the sacred cannot survive." She said the shards were left there for instruction. Some children hummed with blood on their shoulders, fine cuts barely clotting. They were told to hum without ceasing for hours. The exercise was known as attunement. Children who fell out of pitch were removed from the line and sent to the reflection chamber, a windowless closet with no sound, where their mouths were bound with gauze soaked in salt water and anise oil, then wrapped in black cloth. They remained like that for days, sometimes longer. If they returned, their masks were darker. Eliza asked why the masks were glass. Therese explained that stained glass filters impurity, that when light passes through suffering, it is changed. "These children are noise incarnate," she said softly. "Their faces must learn beauty through distortion." She spoke as if she believed it, not as a madwoman, but as a missionary. The more Eliza listened, the more disturbed she became, not by the rituals themselves, but by the elegance of the logic behind them. One evening, Eliza stayed behind after the choir was dismissed. She approached one of the discarded masks left hanging on the far wall. Up close, she saw the inside edges were lined with fine scores, tiny etchings like musical notation carved directly into the glass. Not notes, words. Over and over on the inner rim of the mouthpiece it read, "Silence is song, noise is sin." Each child, Eliza realized, wore this doctrine pressed against their skin for hours every day, absorbing it not just in mind, but through pain. She began to notice how even the youngest children no longer whimpered in their sleep. They breathed in measured cadence, as if harmony had been forced into their very lungs. One girl, no older than 6, began tapping her thumb against her thigh at night in the rhythm of the chime sequence, not for comfort, but from compulsion. The room had changed them, not into singers, not into saints, into instruments. And when 2 of them tried to run, they were broken and reshaped to kneel forever. They arrived in late October when the air turned dry and brittle and the sycamore leaves blew like curled paper across the iron gate. Ruth and Caleb, siblings. Thin and silent, their mother had died in childbirth, another mouth that screamed too long, as Sister Therese noted in the ledger. The children were sent by an uncle no one met. No last name was written beside theirs, just delivered by cart, rain-soaked, compliant. They were placed in separate quarters but made to pray together each morning back to back in the chapel alcove. Caleb had a small scar above his lip, and Ruth wore a locket with no picture inside, just a folded paper with one word: wait. They spoke rarely, but when they did, they used the language of twins, half sentences, glances, soft gestures. Eliza noticed it immediately. They didn't cry. They didn't resist. They studied, listened, counted the staff's footsteps, measured the shifts of light under the door. Sister Therese praised them for their obedience, noting their potential for total conversion. She believed they were pliable. But the siblings weren't submitting. They were observing. The escape came on the 22nd day, nightfall, rain again. Ruth had bent one of the barred window frames with the handle of a water basin. Caleb slipped through first, barefoot, arms scraped raw. Ruth followed, slower, smaller. They made it across the south yard before the alarms were triggered, if they could be called alarms. They weren't bells or whistles. They were voices, chanting. Recordings of children reading scripture backwards, piped through brass cones buried in the hedgerow. The grounds themselves were weaponized with sound. They were caught before the woods. Eliza didn't witness it. No one admitted who did. But the next morning, Ruth was back. In the infirmary, legs elevated, eyes swollen shut, not from injury, but from crying she wasn't allowed to finish. Her legs had been broken in multiple places, and instead of being set to heal, they were fused in a steel brace that forced her lower limbs into a permanent angle of kneeling. Sister Therese called it corrective posture. She said Ruth had sinned with her legs, and now they would know only submission. Eliza cleaned the wounds. She found splinters of bone still pressing up against the inner straps. Ruth made no sound. Caleb was never returned. His bed remained made. His name was not struck from the roster, but a black cross was drawn beside it. When Eliza asked where he'd gone, she was told only that he had entered the final phase. She knew what that meant now. It meant a room no one saw, a procedure no one discussed, a transformation that left no voice behind. Ruth was placed in the choir again within a week, her new posture making it impossible to stand in line. So Sister Therese had a special platform built, raised, centered, where Ruth could kneel motionless and hum alone. Her mouth was bound with a soft leather clamp during sessions. Her hands were never untied, but she no longer reached for anything. She did not look at the other children. She did not tap her knees or flinch when the chimes shattered above her. She had been converted, not into a believer, but into a monument. Eliza once sat beside her during an inspection, kneeling as well, out of solidarity or guilt, she wasn't sure which. She whispered, "Do you want to leave?" Ruth didn't answer, but slowly from the folds of her tunic she produced a single tooth, child-sized, dull at the root. She pressed it into Eliza's palm without looking, then turned her face back toward the wall. Later, Eliza would find Caleb's name scratched faintly into the back of Ruth's headboard with the same tooth. No one else tried to run after that. The gates were never tested. The windows stayed barred, and Ruth, bound in reverent posture, became a living warning. New children were brought before her as part of orientation. Therese called it the kneeling lesson. She would say, "Some fight and are bent. Others bow and are saved." Then she'd lift the hem of Ruth's robe to reveal the brace, shining with polish, and ask, "Which one will you become?" But in the shadows beyond the orchard, something else had already been built, where children were preserved, not buried. It was behind a locked cabinet in the infirmary, a place Eliza had passed dozens of times without noticing. The key was thin, bone-handled, marked only with a black dot at the base. She found it on a ring Therese left hanging after chapel one morning, and curiosity, that fragile thread she had tried to sever for weeks, finally tugged too hard. The lock opened with an uneven snap, metal warped from age or strain. Inside were no medical supplies, no linens, no bandages, only jars. 2 shelves of them, some labeled, some not. They were filled with a thick, dark liquid that shimmered dully in the light like blood left too long in the open. But it wasn't blood, it was ink. The labels read iron tincture, internal use only. A folded paper beside the row held notes in Therese's script. Iron draws from the marrow. The humors become heavy. Speech becomes still. Magnetism of the soul must be corrected. Eliza read those words again and again, unsure if they were metaphor, prescription, or something darker. But in the treatment log, one she wasn't meant to see, there were names, and beside each not a dosage, but a depth. Caleb, 0.2 ml, femoral. Miriam, 0.3 ml, subclavian. Thomas, 1 ml, carotid, failed. Failed. It wasn't used like medicine, it was injected directly into the bloodstream. A heavy iron-based ink, designed not to heal but to settle, to weigh down, to tether. Sister Therese believed that sin rose like steam inside the body, through the blood, through the voice, and that by anchoring it with iron, a child's soul could be kept from corrupting others. Noise, she had once said aloud in passing, is an upward contagion. We must teach the soul to sink. Eliza had taken it for metaphor, but now she saw it for what it was, doctrine in the form of anatomy. The ink had been mixed with clove, mercury salts, and crushed black seed. When held in the hand, the jar vibrated faintly, as if magnetized or somehow alive. Eliza brought one vial to a child named Hiram, who bore faint bruising along his arms but no known injury. She asked gently if he had ever been given the ink. He looked past her and said only, "It hums inside." Then he tapped his chest. Once, twice, slowly. She checked his vitals. His pulse was erratic, not weak but slow, like a drum beaten underwater. In the following days, she scoured the infirmary records. Each child listed under Phase 2 had a corresponding ink entry. There were no medical evaluations, no explanations, just the dose, the depth, and the word still. One file even described a girl named Lenora who had to be restrained after her vocal tremors returned. She had screamed for nearly an hour. After the second injection, she had not spoken again. Not once. Eliza checked her and found that Lenora's fingernails were beginning to darken. Not from bruising, but from within, as if something beneath the skin was leaking upward. The injections left no scars. They were given in silence. Children were led into a room marked sanctum and returned hours later, pale and silent. Not drugged, not dazed, but dimmed, as though a switch inside had been slowly turned toward off. When Eliza confronted Sister Therese, trembling with the ink-stained vial in hand, the nun did not react. She only smiled. "Some burdens must be carried in the blood," she said. "Iron is a sacred metal. It holds sin in place." Years later, when the asylum was raided and the grounds excavated, a coroner's report noted an unusual pattern. Tiny flecks of dark sediment lodged near the hearts of the dead. Not clots, not natural deposits. Metallic particles consistent with crude iron ink. It did not decay. It did not dissolve. It sat there, settled in silence, as if waiting to rise again. The children had been rewritten, not in the mind, not in the soul, but in the very blood that once gave them voice. Eliza never touched the ink again, but she could feel it whenever she closed her eyes. Somewhere just beneath the skin of memory, pooling in the silence between heartbeats. And in a separate wing, those who had already stopped speaking were coated in wax, preserved not to die but to remain eternally still. Eliza had stopped expecting logic. By her 8th month at Black Hollow, she no longer searched for reasons, only patterns. And there was a pattern she'd begun to see. Even if no one spoke it aloud, certain children simply disappeared. Not all at once, gradually. First, their names would vanish from the meal roster. Then their bunks would remain made for days at a time, their linens stripped, folded, but never reassigned. No farewells, no notes to family, no transfer documents, just the quiet removal of presence. She once asked Sister Therese about one such boy, Jonas, age 6, who had stopped humming during choir and started clenching his fists during prayer. Therese answered calmly, "Jonas has been preserved." At the time, Eliza didn't know what that meant. She would soon. The discovery came in the northeast wing, an area long sealed off due to floor instability, according to the staff. Eliza found the key by accident, sewn into the lining of Therese's winter cloak while helping with laundry. The door creaked open to a long corridor, dry and cold despite the summer heat outside. At the end stood a wide, vaulted room, once a chapel by the shape of the walls, but now stripped of pews and windows. What remained was a raised platform ringed with shallow trenches, and at its center a long table lined with pale shapes under linen veils. Not bodies exactly, not statues either. Something between. Eliza lifted the first cloth. Beneath it was a child, or what remained of one. The figure was stiff, kneeling, arms folded across the chest, mouth gently closed. The skin had a yellow sheen to it, slick in some places, cracked in others. Wax, poured layer by layer, she would learn. Not all at once, but gradually, over weeks, even months. The wax coated the skin, hardened it, preserved it like fruit sealed in amber. The child's hair had been plucked clean, follicles cauterized, scalp oiled and smoothed. The eyes were porcelain. Not glass, not painted, but surgical-grade replacements used in funerary practices decades prior. Where the eyelashes should have been, wax filaments had been inserted. Each feature was expressionless, still, eternal. Along the back wall was a table. A ledger lay open, its pages brittle but legible. At the top, scrawled in red ink, it read, "Preservations." Below were 24 entries, each with a name, a posture, a date of finalization. Most bore a single word beside them, success. Others said hair regrew or resin rejection. One simply read, screamed too late. Eliza scanned the names. Jonas was there. So were Caleb, Lenora, Hiram, all the ones she'd noticed missing. All catalogued not as deaths, but as completions. Sister Therese's logic, once horrifying in fragments, now revealed its full structure. She did not see death as a punishment. She saw preservation as reward. These children were not being killed. They were being sealed, fixed in what she believed to be their purest posture, kneeling, praying, head bowed, sometimes smiling faintly, their mouths filled with a drop of wax infused with crushed lavender and myrrh. Therese had turned them into holy figures, frozen in submission. Not martyrs, not victims, icons. One of the bodies had a small fracture in the wax along the cheek. Eliza bent closer and saw beneath the translucent layer the outline of a stitched mouth. Whoever the child was, they had not died quietly. The wax had simply covered it, sealed it, hidden it in reverence. Behind the table stood shelves of supplies. Blocks of beeswax, essential oils, needles, porcelain eyeballs sorted by color, scalpels, scalp disinfectants, iron molds for hands and feet. Each tool was cleaned and labeled. Ritual precision. A single handwritten note pinned above the work table read, "Decay is a symptom of disobedience. Stillness defeats rot." Eliza stepped back, her stomach folding in on itself. She realized the air smelled faintly of cinnamon and something sharper. Formaldehyde, perhaps. Preserved innocence. Manufactured sainthood. These were no longer children. They had become doctrine. That night, Eliza tore out the page in her journal that bore her own name. She burned it in the staff stove and wrote it anew in the margins of an old hymn book. She no longer trusted any official record. Names could be stolen, bodies frozen, eyes replaced. Memory was all that remained. And even that, she feared, could be sealed in wax if she let herself forget what she had seen. In the next room, a boy who could no longer speak began carving warnings into his own skin. Thomas had been at Black Hollow longer than most. No one remembered the day he arrived, not even Eliza, though she recalled the cot they said had always been his. He was mute, not from trauma, not from fear, but from birth, it was believed. He had never spoken a word. But his silence was not the kind Sister Therese revered. He didn't hum. He didn't kneel easily. He watched, closely, unblinking. While the others followed in rhythm, Thomas moved against it, not disruptively, just slightly out of sync. Like he was listening to something deeper than the chimes, like his silence wasn't compliance. It was defiance. The other children noticed. They began to look toward him during prayers, waiting for cues. Some imitated how he tilted his head when Therese passed. A few even began to mirror the way he sat at meals, shoulders square, chin lifted. The change was small, but it spread. Stillness was becoming observation, and Therese noticed. It began with marks on his arms. thin scratches, deliberate, controlled. At first, Eliza thought they were from the harness buckles, but then she saw the angles, the spacing. They were letters. Faint at first, then clearer. On his inner thigh, etched just deep enough to scab, were two words. Help us. Eliza didn't scream when she saw them. She only sank to her knees and wept. It was the first plea she'd seen written from within. Not from the outside world, not from a ledger. From inside the asylum, from skin that refused to be silenced. She tried to protect him. She brought him extra rags, stole ointments from the infirmary, rubbed salve into the letters before they scarred. She begged him not to write more. Not here, not like this. But Thomas had found his voice, and he would not give it back. Days later, on the side of his ribs, he carved Caleb, Eliza guessed. Then on the back of his hand, faint but unmistakable, she's lying. She knew they would discover it. The nuns bathed the children now, inspecting each inch. Eliza did her best to intercept him before inspection, to smear the cuts with waxy salve to distract the others. But one morning the bell rang earlier than usual. The air smelled faintly of vinegar and rust. And Thomas was gone. They found him 2 days later, not in the choir room, not in the cellar, but in the chapel. Hanging upside down from the brass cross behind the pulpit, his body swaying faintly from a cord wrapped around his ankles. His shirt had been removed. Across his chest, carved in thick, deep slashes, were the words, "I kept it." His tongue had been severed and sewn to the center of his right palm with fine thread. His eyes were closed, his arms outstretched like a mock crucifixion, and below him a basin filled with wax and blood, stirred together into a gray, soupy swirl. Sister Therese declared it a tragedy, a sign that the devil had entered the asylum through disobedience. She said Thomas had turned his muteness into vanity and used silence as a weapon. The other children were marched past his body one by one. She forced them to stare at what she called the consequences of hidden speech. When one girl vomited, she was taken to the reflection chamber and returned 2 days later with her mouth stitched shut at the corners. Eliza was not permitted to clean the chapel. A different assistant was brought in for that task. But she found something beneath Thomas's cot that night, slipped between the slats. One last message scraped into a piece of wood with a shard of broken porcelain. "We are not dead." After that, Eliza stopped praying aloud, not from fear but solidarity. She began whispering to herself in her quarters names of the children, the ones who'd vanished, the ones preserved in wax, the ones who still moved but no longer blinked right. She wrote their names into her hymn book, one each night, like a list that might save her own mind from collapse. But by then, the ledger in the basement had already recorded their final postures. And behind a false wall, she would soon discover that ledger, written not with ink, but with blood. The wall was hollow. Eliza discovered it by accident while reaching for a dropped basin behind the shelves in the root cellar, where the air was always colder, and the floor sloped just enough to make standing feel unnatural. Her fingers brushed against uneven plaster, softer than it should have been. She pressed harder. It gave slightly, then cracked. Beneath the thin surface was a narrow seam, vertical, deliberate. She fetched a chisel from the tool shed, returned with hands shaking, and began to pry. The plaster crumbled easily. Behind it was a narrow recess carved into the stone wall, and in it, resting on a folded altar cloth embroidered with tiny red crosses, was a ledger, bound in fabric the color of old milk, speckled with something darker. When she lifted it, the stitching pulled tight and stiff like tendon. It took her a moment to realize the thread was human hair. The cover had no title, just a small indentation in the center, thumb-shaped, and faint symbols embroidered along the border. Not letters, not language, just broken, curling shapes that reminded Eliza of mouths stitched shut. She opened it slowly. The smell was wrong. Old wax and vinegar and something faintly sweet like dried blood. The first page was a dedication. To the still ones, may your posture be eternal. And beneath that, in sharp red script, ST. Each child had a page. Some had several. Name at the top or what passed for it. Many listed only initials or descriptors like the crier, eyes wide, or resists touch. Under each name, intake condition, sin type, posture plan, harmonic rating, and final posture date. It was methodical, cold, yet deeply intimate, as if penned by someone who believed what they were doing was holy. Eliza turned each page slowly, her mouth dry, her hands unsteady. One entry read name, CL sin type, vocality without permission, plan, kneeling, extended, wax infusion if relapse. Final posture date, pending compliance notes, still fights, sleep, eyes show refusal, increase iron. Another for Jonas, name, JN sin type, rhythmic defiance, foot tapping, plan, standing reverence with bowed head, optional choir induction, final posture date, 3.691 notes, failed harmonic alignment, removed early, page after page. Children turned into schedules, sins categorized like illnesses, punishments disguised as treatments. There were diagrams, too, small sketches in red pencil showing ideal limb angles, neck positions, mouth shapes for silence. Each pose was labeled like liturgical posture, supplication, containment, reverent kneel, refused bow. Eliza recognized several. Ruth's brace had been modeled exactly on one of them. Some pages had red wax drops in the corners, melted and pressed with a stamp bearing a crucifix inside a circle. But what chilled her most were the signatures. Every single entry was signed Therese in blood. Not metaphorical ink, not crimson pigment, actual blood. Brown and dried, raised slightly above the page. It had flaked in places, revealing where her quill had pierced through the parchment. Eliza ran her fingertip across one of the signatures and felt her stomach turn. It was still tacky beneath the dust, as if it never fully dried. Toward the back, she found the posture completion log, a list with dates and names followed by a single word. Success, melted, rejected, returned. There were 24 entries under preserved. She recognized them all. And below those, a newer section, candidates for conversion. Thomas's name was there. So was Ruth's, Lenora, Hiram, nearly every child who had once shown resistance. Eliza flipped to her own name, half expecting it. But there was nothing. Not yet. She closed the ledger carefully and returned it to its hiding place, resealing the wall with a tacked-up linen sheet soaked in vinegar to mask the smell. She said nothing to the staff, nothing to the children. But that night she sat by candlelight and copied down every name she could remember from the ledger onto her own skin, using a needle and diluted ink. Tiny marks etched into her thigh. A list only she would carry, so that someone somewhere would know they existed. She no longer prayed, she no longer wept. But she remembered, and that, in this place, was its own sin. Soon the fire would come, but not before Therese gave each of them one final posture to hold. The fire began on the coldest night of that winter. February 3rd, 1892. The frost had cracked the outer panes of the east wing, and the wind moved through Black Hollow like breath through broken teeth. No one knows who lit the first flame. Some say it started in the laundry furnace where the wax and oils were kept. Others claimed lightning struck the southern spire, though no storm had been forecast that week. But Eliza would later insist it started lower, beneath the floors in the spaces no maps dared show. in the rooms that smelled of wax, of vinegar, of things never meant to burn. By the time smoke bled from the chapel roof, most of the asylum was already gone. The fire didn't rage. It crept, methodical, quiet, moving in the same slow rhythm as Sister Therese's sermons. By dawn, the building stood like a hollowed-out ribcage. Only black beams and ash, no screams, no visible panic. Just collapse. Only when the local authorities arrived did they find what remained. Inside the kneeling cell, once part of the posture training corridor, they found Eliza, half-conscious, her clothes burned through in patches, her hands bound behind her back with linen soaked in wax. Next to her, curled on the floor, was a girl no older than 7, eyes closed, breathing shallow. Her knees had been fused into permanent bend, her mouth sealed shut with resin. They were the only 2 found alive. Every other room was empty or staged. In the chapel, 20 waxen children knelt around the altar, untouched by flame. Their bodies gleamed under falling ash like false saints. Beneath the floorboards, in narrow vertical tombs, authorities unearthed 7 standing coffins, each just large enough to hold a child upright, each nailed shut with no sign of air holes. Inside, remains were found in postures too stiff for rigor mortis. One girl had both hands fused in a prayer position with melted wax at the joints. Another bore no fingernails, only raw beds packed with salt. In the choir room, the chimes had collapsed into a heap of tangled wire and glass, but no bodies were there. The masks were missing. So were the porcelain eyes. Only the iron mouth clamps remained, stacked neatly in a corner like tools no longer needed. The staff had vanished. No bodies were recovered, no signs of struggle. As if the fire had chosen who to spare and who to erase. But most haunting was the absence of Sister Therese. Her quarters were found intact, untouched by flame, the bed still made, gloves folded at the foot. On the nightstand sat her ledger, charred at the corners but still legible. The final entry read, "The final silence has begun. May the voice never rise again." There was no signature, just a single drop of blood pressed into the page. Outside, behind the orchard where the frost never seemed to melt, investigators uncovered a pit lined with ash and glass fragments. Dozens of teeth were found buried in neat rows, not scattered, arranged, counted, each molar scrubbed clean, free of root. Some marked with small letters in red wax, not initials, just one word repeated again and again. Still. The girl found with Eliza never spoke. She was transferred to a convalescent home upstate and died within a year. Her cause of death was listed as respiratory failure, but the staff noted she had refused to breathe too deeply. Eliza recovered slowly. She would not speak of what happened. Not then. Not during the inquest. Not in the years that followed. But she kept one thing, one glove from Therese's nightstand, not as a relic, as a warning. Black Hollow Asylum was never rebuilt. The state seized the land and declared it condemned. No memorial was erected, no names were carved. It was as if the children had never been there at all. But decades later, when the land was cleared for redevelopment, workers unearthed a sealed room beneath the ruins, undisturbed by time, flame, or frost. Inside were 7 small chairs arranged in a circle, each with a name carved into the seat, and in the center a jar filled with black ink and a needle resting across its lid. Sister Therese was never seen again. But memory has a posture of its own, one that never kneels and never forgets.